Hey, Pastor Tarun here. Welcome to Authentic Church. It's so good to have you with us. We really pray that this sermon blesses you and helps you to experience the authentic love of Jesus Christ in your life today. Hey, before we get into the message, can you do me a favor and hit the subscribe button so that we can keep you up to date with the latest sermons every week? All right, here's the message.
But today what I want to talk about is the topic of you're not as right as you think you are. Oh, somebody just said to themselves, that's what you think. You're not as right as you think you are. I don't know if you have this trouble. I'm going to be honest. I struggle with this. I think I'm smarter than the average person. All right? I'm going to be honest now. Your pastor struggles with a little bit of pride. Sometimes he thinks that he knows better than people around him. And sometimes he gets frustrated when people don't see the world the way that he sees it. I know none of you are like that. But I'm like that sometimes. Sometimes I say things to myself like, I can't believe they can't do that. Or I can't believe they didn't do it the way that I would have done it. Oh my gosh, how much do I have to explain it to somebody before they figure it out? Has anybody ever said this to you? Oh no, you're not. You're all polishing your halos, aren't you? You don't think like this at all. Look, the reality is all of us think like this at some point. All of us get frustrated with other people because we believe ourselves to understand a situation better than the people around us. And what I have found is that when we take this approach into life, what can often happen is if we don't catch ourselves soon enough, our belief that we know best can lead us to getting angry and offended with others when we probably shouldn't. When we go through life and we view it through our lens of experience, what we can sometimes do is we can miss the bigger picture that's going on around us. You know that cashier that didn't give you the customer service that you thought you deserved because you spent hundreds of dollars in their shop and they should have smiled better? And you were thinking to yourself, I can't believe how rude that person was. And if I was the manager of this store, I'd give her a piece of my mind. You know, sometimes we look at the picture through our lens and we say we know best, but sometimes behind that is another story. Sometimes there's a person that's doing the best they can with the life they've got. Sometimes it's a single mum that just spent the morning wrestling with her children and trying to get them to school and worrying about how she's going to pay her bills. And so she's so stressed out, she doesn't know how to smile at you because she's too busy trying to figure out how she's going to keep her head above water for the next day. Does anybody know what I'm talking about? You know, sometimes you can encounter somebody that is snappy and angry and they just lose their temper really quickly and we think to ourselves, gee, they're so rude. I can't believe they just snapped at me, or I can't believe they got angry at me. But then underneath the anger, if we took the time to talk to them, if we took the time to get to know them, we might find that they've got a mother who's dying of cancer. Or they've got a child that's struggling at school and is finding it difficult to make friends. Or they're going through a divorce and they don't know what to do because their world is falling apart. And just the mere mention of a particular topic brings up a well of emotion and a well of hurt and a well of rejection that maybe you had nothing to do, but you just happened to be there when it all came out. Are you tracking with me? Sometimes we think we know best when actually underneath the surface there's a whole bunch of other stuff going on. If we're going to be people that learns to manage our offense well, if we're going to be people that learns to love others like Jesus loved us, then one of the things we have to do is we have to take a step back from our own belief that we know best. Sometimes it's not wrong, it's just different. If you're taking notes, I want you to write that down. Sometimes when we encounter people who live a different way, who respond differently to a circumstance than we would, or maybe doesn't do things the way that we would like them done, our natural tendency is to say that's wrong, and that's why we get upset. But very often, what we call wrong is not wrong, it's just different. It's just different to our experience. It's just different to our perspective on life. There's a famous story, some of you might have heard it. There was a young lady, she was cooking with her mum, and they were cooking for Christmas, and they were getting the lamb leg ready to cook in the oven, and the mother got out a knife and she cut off the end of the lamb roast before she put it in the oven, and she cut off about 2 centimeters on both sides, and she put it into the oven. And the little girl says to her mum, she says, "Mum, why did you cut off the ends to the roast?" And she said, she thought about it for a minute, and she said, I don't really know. That's just the way my mum always did it. Maybe you should ask Grandma. Maybe Grandma might know why we cut the ends off the roast. And so the little girl, she gets on the phone and she calls up Grandma and she says, "Grandma, I was making the Christmas dinner with Mum, and she cut 2 centimeters off each end of the roast, and I don't know why. And she said that you always used to do that. Do you know why we cut the end off the roast?" And Grandma thought about it for a minute and she said, "I don't think I do know why. I've always done it because that's what my mother did." But lucky for you, great-grandmother, she's still alive. So if you give her a call, maybe great-grandma will be able to tell you why we cut the end off the lamb roast. And so little girl, she gets on the phone and she rings up her great-grandma and she says, "Great-grandma, I've got a question for you. I was making roast dinner with Mum, getting ready for Christmas, and she cut 2 centimeters off both ends of the lamb roast, and I couldn't figure out why, and she didn't know why, and she said to ask Grandma, and Grandma didn't know why, and she said to ask you, do you know why we cut 2 centimeters off the edge of the lamb roast?" And great-grandma started laughing. And she said, "Actually, I do." She said, "When I got married, me and my husband, we were very poor, and we didn't have a lot, and we had this little house, and it had a tiny little oven that wasn't very big. And it couldn't fit a full baking pan. It had to fit one of those half-size baking pans. And when I wanted to cook a roast, I couldn't fit a full leg of lamb because it wouldn't fit in the half-size baking pan. And so what I used to do is I would cut off a centimeter off this side and a couple of centimeters off that side, and I'd put them off to one side on the pan so it would fit in the oven." So, sometimes we do things because that's the way our families have always done it. And we think that that's the right way to do it. And when somebody does it differently to us, what do? We find ourselves getting indignant, or we find ourselves wanting to correct them and say, "That's not the way to do it. That's not right. I know how to do it. Let me show you." Has anybody ever struggled with that? 3 of you have. Fantastic. You're making your pastor feel very insecure today. Sometimes we find ourselves getting upset with the way other people live, with the way other people see the world, with the way other people talk, with the way other people get through life, because we see it one way based on the way that we were raised. And what we don't realize is sometimes we don't even know why we do it ourselves. Hello. Sometimes we have to take a step back and say, hang on a second, if they're doing things differently, maybe I should take the time to figure out why. And maybe even after I figure out why, even if I don't agree with what they do or how they live or how they speak, is it possible that I could see things from their point of view and maybe express some understanding, maybe express some forgiveness, maybe express some patience instead of anger and offense? Jesus told a story once in Luke 18, and I'm going to read the story to you. And it says this: Jesus was at the temple one day, and he was watching 2 men who went up to the temple to pray. One was a Pharisee, and the other was a tax collector. Now, let me give you some context before I read this story, because we probably don't understand fully the implication of Pharisee and tax collector. A Pharisee was essentially a teacher of the law, the teacher of God's word. If you want another word for Pharisee in Jesus' day, it was kind of like, he was like the pastor. He was the guy that taught you the Bible. Now, Pharisees were very, very interested in making sure that everybody lived according to what God's word said. Pharisees were very interested in making sure everybody lived right so that God would be favorable to them and be loving towards them. And so at the heart of what Pharisees did and at the heart of who Pharisees were, they wanted to do the right thing. The problem was sometimes Pharisees got so obsessed with doing it one way that they would get very angry or they would get very judgmental with people who did things a little bit differently. And so here you have a Pharisee and you have a tax collector. Now, the tax collector in Jesus' day is quite different to the tax collector today. The tax collector, like the ATO, is a government department, and it's pretty much, got a whole bunch of rules and regulations so that they can't cheat you out of too much, although some of you might disagree with that assessment. But the tax collector in Jesus' day was somebody who worked for the Roman Empire. And the Roman Empire would say everybody has to pay a certain portion of their income to Caesar as tribute. And what they would say to the tax collector is this: as long as Caesar gets his tribute, you can charge whatever you like on top of that for your own trouble. And so what you had was a whole bunch of guys who would extort the public by charging exorbitant tax rates so that they could make themselves rich. They would say, Caesar needs $1, but my fee for collecting that dollar is $2, so you owe us $3. And so the tax collectors were not very well liked. They were kind of more like mafia. They were thugs. They would beat you up or they would hurt you if you didn't pay your taxes, and they were not very well liked. So with that context in mind, you've got the teacher of God's word and you've got the thug who extorts people. And Jesus is watching them go into the temple. And the Pharisee stood by himself and he prayed and he said, God, I thank you that I'm not like other people. Not like those robbers and evildoers and people who commit adultery. And I'm definitely not like this tax collector. Can you imagine if somebody came to church and prayed like that? God, I thank you that I'm not like all these people that I pastor. I thank you that I'm not like Rick and Elsa. I wish I was like Rick and Elsa, actually. I thank you that I'm not so messed up like that person, and I'm not such a screw up like this person. God, I thank you that I'm so amazing. Can you imagine if your pastor prayed like that? How many people would keep coming back to church? I don't think you would. So here's this Pharisee. He's thanking God for how good he is, especially in comparison to the tax collector. But he goes on as if that wasn't good enough. He then begins to tell God how good he is. He said, God, I fast twice a week. I give 1/10 of everything I get to you. But the tax collector stood up at a distance, and he wouldn't even look up to heaven. He beat his chest and he said, God, have mercy on me. I'm a sinner. I'm a failure. What did Jesus say? Jesus said this: I tell you that the man, the tax collector, rather than the Pharisee, went home right before God. All of those who exalt themselves, make themselves more important, will be humbled. But those who humble themselves will be exalted. You know what this story tells us is Jesus is not looking at how good or how bad you are. Jesus is not looking at how right or how wrong you might think you are or somebody else is. What Jesus is asking is, how's your heart? How's your attitude? Do you have an attitude of pride, of arrogance, that I'm better than everybody else? Or do you have an attitude of, you know what, God, I know I've made mistakes. I know I'm a mess. I know I don't get things right. And so, God, I need your mercy just like other people need your mercy. You see, what Jesus teaches us is this, that the question is not so much about whether you're right or whether you're wrong. The question is whether you are proud or whether you are humble. The book of James says that Jesus or God rejects the proud, but he gives grace to the humble. When we approach God in humility, when we say, God, I need you. God, I haven't got it all together. God, I'm a mess. God says, you know what? There's grace for you. There's mercy for you. There's forgiveness for you. There's acceptance for you. But when we walk around saying, God, I'm so much better than everybody else. God, you should smite my enemies. You should bring judgment upon those people because they don't live the way that I live. You should have a word with Rick and Elsa about how they've been behaving because I just find them very offensive, God. You know what God says? Cool off. Cool off. I'm not going to get involved in your offense. I'm not going to get involved in your prideful attitude. I'm not going to get involved in your anger. You know, Kai preached a couple of weeks ago and he talked about, sometimes as Christians we like to say, I'm angry with righteousness. I'm angry for the things of God. It's a bit absurd, isn't it? Because we don't claim that about anything else that we do. We don't say that we're righteously gluttonous, although I wish that was a thing. We don't say that we're righteously adulterous. We don't say that we're righteously hateful. It's not a thing. Anger causes animosity between us and other people. It causes animosity or separation between us and God. There's no righteous anger. There's no right anger. There's only humility. There's only, God, I mess up too. I didn't like the way that person spoke to me, but God, I pray that you would give them grace because I understand what it is to make mistakes. I understand what it is to get angry myself. I told some of you at the beginning of this series, I was talking about not taking offense, and then that week all the stuff with Andrew Thornburg and the Essendon Football Club started happening, and I felt a little bit angry. I felt a little bit indignant, and I went against my normal protocol. I don't normally post things on Facebook when I'm annoyed, and I posted something when I was annoyed, and almost immediately it brought tension between me and my best friend. And straight away I recognized, hang on a second, this is not what God has called me to do. God has not called me to be right. God has not called me to correct other people and tell them how wrong they are. God's called me to love people. And he's called you to love people too. And so if what I'm saying and what I'm doing is going to cause tension or anger between you and another person, then we need to walk away from it. Better to say nothing and be right than to be wrong and lose a friend. Hello? Better to say nothing and be right than to lose a friend in anger. See, too often we're so focused on making sure other people do things our way, making sure that other people see the world our way, making sure that people live the way that we think they should live. And one of the things we've got to do is we've got to, there's an old expression that when I was growing up, they used to say, let go and let God. Let go and let God. It's not your job to control other people. It's not your job to figure other people's problems out. It's not your job to tell people how wrong they are. It's your job to let God do that. God will work in all of us. It's your job to love people. It's your job to forgive people. It's your job to extend mercy when mercy is required. What I've found is that when we operate out of pride, when we operate out of an attitude of I'm right and everybody else is wrong, it leads to a characteristic called self-righteousness. It means I'm so good and you're less good than me. Self-righteousness leads to arrogance. Arrogance leads to anger. Anger leads to bitterness. And bitterness is like drinking poison and hoping another person dies. All you're doing is hurting yourself. You might be right, but the question is, Are you loving? You might be right, but have you shown love in the process? And all too often, being right leads us to being at odds with other people. People are not drawn to Jesus by our moral superiority. People are not drawn to Jesus because they see how good we are. People are drawn to Jesus because they need to know that they are loved. They need to know that they're forgiven. And Jesus asks all of us to show that to others. Are you still with me? You know, Jesus is the only one, the Bible says, that never sinned. He's the only one that really could claim moral superiority. He's the only one that could say, hey, look at how good I am. I never make mistakes like you guys. And yet Jesus hung around sinful people more than most of us. He deliberately went out of his way to find people who were marginalized, who were rejected, who were pushed out of society. And he deliberately went out of his way to show love and mercy and forgiveness. I mean, he went and had lunch with a tax collector, Zacchaeus. And in having lunch with the thug, with the mafia boss, that man found love and forgiveness, and he was transformed. He went and forgave a woman who was found committing adultery, and he says, I don't condemn you. Now you have an opportunity to change your life. Instead of stoning her like he could have done, he chose to forgive her and love her. As he was having lunch with his friends, a prostitute poured perfume on his feet to acknowledge his importance in her life. And everybody else at the table sat there saying, Jesus, how could you possibly let somebody so sinful, so degraded, touch you? And Jesus said, you know, she's done something for me that's far better than even you have done. She showed me honor when even you didn't show me honor. Jesus spent time with people who he even knew were going to betray him. One of his own disciples, Judas, ended up betraying Jesus. And Jesus knew the whole time. Don't you find that amazing? Jesus knew that his best friend was going to betray him, and yet he never showed anger towards him. In fact, he showed trust. He made Judas the treasurer. He made Judas the accountant. He said, hey, look after all my money. Can you imagine that? Doing that to somebody who you didn't trust, who you knew was going to betray you, saying to them, hey, I know that you're going to betray me, but I want you to be in charge of all my finances. We just wouldn't do it, would we? But Jesus went one step further. Jesus even, on one occasion, he got out a bowl of water and he wrapped a towel around himself and he went and he washed the feet of his disciples. The act of washing feet was the act that a servant would perform for a master. When a master would come home from walking the dusty streets of Jerusalem, the servant would get the bowl of water and wash their feet to clean them. And it was a sign of respect and honor. If a guest came into your house, you would offer them a bowl of water to wash their feet. Here is Jesus, the master, the perfect one, the one who has never sinned, gets his disciples, the screw-ups, the guys that are constantly making mistakes, even the one that is going to betray him, and he kneels down in front of them like a servant and says, let me wash your feet. I wonder how many times we've actually done that for those who have hurt us, or those who we know offend us, or those who do wrong by us. How often do we actually love people the way Jesus loved them? John 13:1 said, Jesus knew that the hour had come for him to leave the world and go to the Father. Having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. Jesus was still loving people even when they put him up on a cross and they committed him to die. As he was hanging there beaten and bloody and bruised, nails piercing his hands and feet, he looked down upon the same people that had harmed him and said, Father, forgive them because they've got no clue what they're doing. You know, one of the things that I have to remind myself over and over again when people upset me or people frustrate me or people are not as clever as I am, I have to say to myself, God, I need your forgiveness, and I'm going to forgive that person, even if they did wrong by me. I need your patience, so I'm going to give that person patience because I know that I need it too. I need love when I don't deserve it, and so I'm going to give love to that person even though they don't deserve it. It's one of the things that we have to, it's a rhythm of life we have to remind ourselves, because our default position is to always go back to, I'm right and they are wrong. Jesus said something very curious before he left his disciples. In John chapter 13, he said, "My children, I will be with you only a little longer, and you will look for me. And just as I told the Jews, I will tell you now, where I'm going, you cannot come. But a new commandment I give you." A new commandment, all right, supersedes all the other commandments, all the other rules, all the other regulations. A new commandment I give to you: love each other the way that I have loved you. And by this, everybody will know that you are my disciples, if you love one another. You know, one of the sad things I believe about today's society is that people outside the church, by and large, have a fairly negative attitude towards the church. You know, if you talk to people who have never been to church, a lot of them will say things like Christians are bigots. Christians hate people. The church is, you know, an archaic religion that needs no attention anymore. It's got nothing to offer the world. Now, as believers, as Christians, we will sometimes say, hey, but that's not what we are. That's not what we stand for. But the question I've got to ask you is, why does the world think that? Why does the world think that? The world thinks that because for too long, Christians and the church have spent too much time telling the world that they were right and you are wrong, and spending too much time condemning people instead of loving people. And Jesus said, do you want people to know that you follow me? The way they know is if you love me. And if you love them the way that you love me. See, if we want to change the world's perception of Jesus, and if we want to change the world's perception of the church, we don't have to go on a march and protest. We don't have to wave placards down at Parliament House. Jesus gave us the guidance right here. All we have to do is we have to love people the way that Jesus loved us. And not just the people that we like. We have to learn to love the people we don't like too. You know, the person that makes your coffee wrong at the cafe? Some of you don't struggle with this like I do. When you love coffee the way that I do and somebody makes you a bad coffee, it's offensive. But I have to love them. I have to say, Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. Literally. People need to know they're loved, not that they're wrong. When you love somebody, most people will actually correct their own behavior. Did you know that? If you see something in somebody that you don't like, if you just love them, very often they will already be aware of the behavior in their own life that they need to change. But what they need is a safe place or a safe environment to make change. Most people don't change because they don't feel like they can trust anybody. And so that becomes their default position. It's like cutting the ends off the lamb roast. They just do it because that's what they've always done. And what they need is for somebody to say, hey, you know what? You're safe with me. You're safe to make mistakes. You're safe to get it wrong. Because no matter what, I'm going to love you. No matter what, I'm going to forgive you. No matter what, I'm going to show you mercy. No matter what, I'm going to show you kindness. When we start to love people, they change by themselves. God does his work in people's lives. We don't have to change them. We just have to love them. Jesus was the most right person that ever lived, and yet he was the least judgmental person ever. People need to know they are forgiven, not condemned. You know, in the church we use this word sinner or sin. And sometimes I think it's a bit of a confusing word because it makes up images in our head that makes us think all sorts of things about people. You know, if somebody said, oh, you're a sinner, what do you think of? You think of probably somebody that does all the worst things, maybe somebody that does criminal things, maybe somebody that does immoral things. We attach ideas to words and we say, oh, that person's a sinner. And that person's a saint. You know, what is a saint? Somebody who's good and kind and loving. Do you know what the word sinner in Greek just means? It's an archery term. It just means miss the mark. Just miss the mark. If you sin, it means you missed the mark. Now, I don't know if you've ever watched archery in the Olympics, but whether you miss by 2 centimeters or whether you miss by 2 meters, it's still a miss. Hello? Too often we attach the word to people who do really bad stuff or what we think is really bad. And we say, oh yeah, well, I'm not like that. I'm not like those sinful people, like the Pharisee. I'm not like that tax collector. I've just got, I make the occasional mistake. When we've got to understand is that all of us miss the mark. All of us get it wrong. All of us mess up. One of the things I had to laugh about, as controversial as it was, when, the big furor about Israel Folau posting stuff about homosexuals, and it caused quite a stir, and I'm sure you all heard about it. And, the same passage talks about homosexuals. It also talks about gossips. Oh, we didn't mention that, did we? Nobody talked about, church is famous for its gossip. It talks about adulterers. It talks about people who lie. We don't talk about that, do we? What we do is we take a category of people and we say, well, they're really bad and we need to judge them. But, look, I might gossip a little bit, but, it's just to help you. I'm just telling you about this person so you can pray for them. I don't gossip, but Pastor, I need you to know this because they need some prayer. Come on. Oh, no, I'm not like those people. But you're lying to your spouse and not telling them things that they should know. Or you're lying to your boss. Or you're not being honoring to the people that you work with. You see, we put categories of sin and we say those people are wrong and I'm okay. I'm in a different category. But sin is sin. You miss the mark by this much or you miss the mark by that much, you still need God's forgiveness. You still need God's mercy, and that's me too. Right? So I want to help you all out in the 5 minutes I've got left before we wrap up. I want to help you out. Your pastor's not perfect. Your pastor's a mess. He's a hot mess. All right? Your pastor grew up in a Christian home, and when he was 20, he walked away from the church and he did all sorts of things that he shouldn't have done. Your pastor spent most of his early 20s doing all the things that you think a pastor shouldn't do. I won't go into them in detail, but I can tell you now, if you're thinking it, I probably did it. Your pastor made mistakes even when he got married to the most beautiful woman in the world. He nearly messed that one up too. Your pastor's had days when he's not a good dad. Sometimes he yells at his kids. I know, shocking. There's even been the occasion when your pastors let the odd swear word go. I know, you're horrified, aren't you? Not Pastor Mel, but just me. Your pastor's been grumpy. Your pastor's lost his patience with people. Your pastor's told lies. Your pastor's found it hard to forgive people. I've missed the mark. Well, I'm not telling you that to say, look how humble I am, because that would kind of be the opposite of humility, wouldn't it? But I tell you this to say this. Don't ever get caught up putting somebody on a pedestal and judging yourself or judging other people by what you think that person is like. See, too often what we do is we look at somebody and we say, oh, that person's perfect. They've got their life together. We look at people on Instagram and we see their perfect life compared to our mess. And we say, why can't my life be better? Well, you know what? Their life's not any better than your life. They just chose to show you the best parts on Instagram. Hello? And so when we encounter somebody that's a mess, when we encounter somebody that lets us down, when we encounter somebody that doesn't get it right, we can step back and say, hey, you know what? That's me too. That's me too. I need love. I need forgiveness. I need patience. I need kindness. And if I need it, then that means you need it. Offense will only poison you from the inside out. holding on to bitterness, holding on to anger, holding on to unforgiveness, it will poison you from the inside out. But if you can learn to say, Jesus, forgive them, just as you have forgiven me, what you will find is that you will live happier, you will sleep better, you will love more completely. And more than anything, others will see Jesus in you and say, hey, that's the Jesus I've heard about. That's the Jesus I want to be. The Apostle Paul says in 1 Corinthians, and I'm going to finish with this passage. He says, if I speak with the tongues of men or of angels, but I do not have love, I'm just like a resounding gong or a clanging cymbal. If I have the gift of prophecy and I can fathom all the mysteries and all the knowledge, and if I have faith that can move mountains, but I do not have love, I am nothing. If I give all my possessions to the poor and I give my body to hardship, that I may boast and say, look at how good I am. But if I don't have love, I have nothing. At the end of the day, there are three things that remain: faith, hope, and love. And the greatest of these is love. Is love.
Thanks so much for joining us today. We really pray that that message blessed you. If you enjoyed it, why don't you share it with a friend that you think will enjoy it also? And hit a like and give us a comment, because we'd love to hear back from you. If you'd like to give to the work of Authentic Church or get more involved, head over to our website, authenticchurch.com.au. We look forward to seeing you next time.